Welcome to the Church with No Walls podcast.
Welcome to the Church with No Walls podcast teaser edition. My name is Ryan Dearbone, and I am the host of this podcast. And this podcast is a podcast I hope that you will enjoy. And this is just a little teaser to kind of explain to you what the podcast is about and some of the people that you will be listening to over the course of the next few episodes. So this podcast was born out of a thought process I had about maybe 2.5, 3 years ago, as the pandemic was still fairly raging. And so at that point, I was working in the media ministry of my church here in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which I still am. I am the media minister. And I got to thinking about, okay, there are so many people that are not in church right now because of the pandemic, and so many people that are working as media ministers, whether they were media ministers or media teams prior to the pandemic, because your church had that type of equipment, or were kind of starting to go that way, and then people that became media teams out of necessity because of the fact that there was no in-person meeting because of the pandemic. So I got to thinking about what does that look like on the other side? What does that look like once we get back into our churches, if we ever do? What does that look like for churches that are going through it? And I know my church isn't the only one, obviously. So there are other churches that are going through the same exact process, trying to figure out what do we do next? How long is this going to last? How do we stay solvent in a ever-changing world that is basically shut down because of a worldwide pandemic? And then whenever we do get out of that, what does that look like in terms of getting people back in the sanctuaries themselves, as well as maintaining and even growing that online presence? Does social media grow with it? Does these live streams and other things that we've been doing in this interim, do they fade away? What exactly does that look like? So I thought about that a few times. I was like, hey, it would be kind of cool to do something along those lines, of whether it's a documentary, whether it's a academic journal article, something to look at that, take a deeper dive in what that means. And so as we started coming out of the pandemic, I said, okay, now that's time. Let's start looking at it. So initially it was going to be a documentary. This was going to be a documentary film. I was even ebbing towards doing some sort of academic journal, even if it was a short doc and then an academic journal piece to accompany it. Then I realized, it may just be better to err on the side of simplicity rather than going through a whole big process in production to record through video some of these other ways that people have done it. And people are not going to have some of the pictures of them doing these media ministries, because it may have just been one person in the church, might have been a pastor all by themselves. So my thought process, and let me back up real quick. I'm a former TV news journalist, so I'm familiar with how capturing stories works and how important it is to capture a story and to tell a story, and to be at the forefront of being able to give information to others and make sure that information is both factual as well as interesting. So moving back to the initial thought, so I thought, rather than try to do that and try to tell everybody's story, how about I do a podcast where I can invite on people from wherever to talk about what they did and how they were able to make it through the pandemic, and whether it meant creating a media ministry from scratch or adjusting the media ministry that they had. And what does that look like for them now that we are out of the pandemic and going in towards the future? So I reached out to several pastors. So you'll hear on this podcast several pastors and religious figures. I reached out to a historian of religion who is a he is a professor emeritus, Larry Snyder at Western Kentucky University. I've reached out to people who are members of churches virtually, who have decided, either because of necessity, I can't go back into the church building or I'm unable to at this time. But other people who one woman who lives in Atlanta, Georgia, but is actually a full member of the church I go to, State Street Baptist Church, here in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And what does that look like for her? What does that mean for her to be able to participate in a church that she actually grew up in, but now finds herself about 4 hours away, but still is now able to be a full member, attend services virtually, and be able to be a part of the process. So talk to her, talk to several other people who are media ministers themselves, who actually are doing the work, who are every Sunday or every time that the church has a service or a event, they're the ones who are live streaming, because somebody's got to do it. These are the people that are doing it. I also spoke to one man who his company was doing installs of television screens, of live streaming equipment before the pandemic, but to see how the business grew and changed and just completely got turned on its head because of the necessity for churches to have this type of equipment in the pandemic. And several things that I learned throughout the process of interviewing all these people from different walks of life, from different experiences with the pandemic and expertise levels of media ministry, is that this is such a new phenomenon. Yes, media ministry has been around for a while, because if you were able to watch Jimmy Swaggart, Kenneth Copeland, T.D. Jakes, they've had television and they've had media for a long time. But not everybody's had that luxury. And now we're at a place where anybody, if you've got a cell phone, if you've got a tablet, if you've got any type of device, you can produce a church service that can not only air on social media for your immediate church family, but for anyone across the globe. So how does that change the way pastors are preaching the sermons, the way they format their services? How do people respond to watching a service from being at home? Are they more passive because they don't have to be in the sanctuary and do some of the things that they had to do? Where does church hurt fit into all of this? These are some of the topics we talk about in this podcast. I found it very interesting when I peeled back some of the layers and talked to some of these people to find out exactly what this new form of media ministry means to them. Has it brought them closer to God? Has it become more of a job because they're spending their time rather than sitting and worshiping? Now they're in charge of the worship experience of everybody else. And then I also asked them, what does this look like 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the future? Does that fact that we have all of these different areas of social media, we can live stream, we can go virtual with the click of a button, does that mean that we're going to end up losing the physical brick and mortar churches that we've become so accustomed to, that we've known all of our lives? Does the church expand outside the walls that have for many years siloed them and segregated them? Because my pastors said, and I'm sure a lot of other pastors have said, the most segregated place in the world is a church on Sunday morning, because you go to hear your pastor at your church, and that's all you do. Now, are these walls breaking down? Are these walls expanding? And if so, what exactly does that look like? It was a very interesting journey, and I hope that as you listen to this podcast, to the different people that we bring on and the different stories that they tell, some of them are very harsh in the fact that things didn't always go the way they thought it would. I hope that you enjoy it. I hope that you take something away from it. I will even say that I got the pleasure of interviewing my father-in-law, who is from Cape Town, South Africa, and happened to be vacationing here in the States while I was recording this over the past, I'd say it's been about 6 months that I've been recording these interviews. And it was interesting to get his perspective on what they were doing in Cape Town, South Africa, which is literally a world away from here in Kentucky. Some things were very similar, some things were different. And it was interesting to hear his take on it, even what he would see when they were able to glance across the ocean to us here in the States, what we were doing, what their thoughts were on it. So I was very happy to be able to talk to so many different people and get so many different thoughts. So I hope that you will enjoy this podcast. I hope that this will start conversation at your church, with your friends, with your family, what this means to you. If your church is already doing it, are there different ways to do it? What does this mean in a greater sense of community, of church? Does it expand on your ministry? Does it constrict your ministry? From there, I hope that this expands your thought palette, and maybe there's churches that aren't doing this. Maybe this gives you a reason why. Here's why you should do it. Maybe you say, hey, after listening to this, I like it, that sounds good, but still not for us. That's cool too. But I hope this podcast overall gives you something to think about, and hopefully it's enjoyable. Like I said, I did my best to try to find some of the most interesting people I could get my hands on and talk to them about this new world, this new media ministry, and how it has changed the game for religion and churches, and hopefully how it will continue to change in a positive manner. So with that being said, that's your teaser. Hopefully that did enough to get you to listen to the rest of the podcast episodes. And if you have any thoughts, any questions, we would love to hear from you. Please make sure that you like this podcast, that you connect with us, and you tell us what you liked, what you didn't like, what thoughts you had. Maybe you have a story. Maybe there's a church that you attend and you're the media minister, or you're a member virtually, or whatever. You have a story that you want to share. We'd love to hear it. Would love to be able to talk to you about it. So with that, I am Ryan Dearbone, and I am the host of the Church with No Walls podcast, and I hope to hear from you soon. Enjoy the podcast. Take care.